I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to The Daily, where you wait ages for a world leader and then three turn up at once. Well, technically 2.5. China's Xi Jinping and Russia's Vladimir Putin have been meeting in Beijing, promoting their alliance and their new world order away from the West. We'll be speaking to our Moscow and Asia correspondents just a little later. But closer to home, Sir Keir Starmer had a big day. Not quite a world leader just yet, though given the polls, he can probably smell the coffee served at G7 summits already. Today, he set out his 6 priorities if/when he becomes Prime Minister. Deliver economic stability, cut waiting times, launch a new border security command, set up Great British Energy, crack down on antisocial behaviour and recruit 6,500 new teachers. But is this grand plan as bold as might initially appear? Sam Coates is our deputy political editor and he joins us once again on the podcast. Good to see you, Sam. This 6-point plan from Sir Keir Starmer looks a little bit more like promises, not policies to me.
Look, today is a marketing and political communication exercise. We haven't learned something new about Keir Starmer. He hasn't made any new promises, pledges, next steps, first steps, or whatever they want to call it. Since Keir Starmer became leader of the opposition in 2020, Labour have said an enormous number of things. Sometimes people don't think that Keir Starmer has a particularly developed policy offering. In fact, he's got an awful lot out there. I think even Keir Starmer would admit it's been a bit of a mishmash. And now with the general election approaching, they need to boil it down. And today is the product of that boiling down exercise to get 6 things on a card. I've been looking back at the 1997 pledge card that Tony Blair offered, and of course a lot of Keir Starmer's way of campaigning does remind you of Blair's approach.
Certainly does.
There were quite a lot of specifics in that. There was a class size, measurable specific. There was stuff about halving the time from arrest to sentencing for young offenders. Stuff that you could measure, and people did measure. And actually, if you fast forward to 2001, when the next election happened, pretty much Tony Blair had achieved all the things on those pledges. When you look at the 6 next steps or first steps that Keir Starmer has produced today, I'm not sure you'll ever be able to measure them, because when you look at them, quite a lot of them are vaguer, there are bigger caveats, and they are more about positioning and in some cases changing structures than delivering specific things that are going to improve people's lives.
Let's start with one of them, which I think is to my mind perhaps the most airy-fairy. Deliver economic stability. I mean, it would be a fine thing if an opposition leader stood up and said that he wasn't going to offer the country economic stability. And frankly, that could mean any number of things, couldn't it?
That's right. And the Labour Party are promising not to deliver economic instability. They're sort of promising not to have a financial crash. And by the way, financial crashes or big economic events are often not in the gift of government. So if they had it, they would say it was out of their control anyway. Beneath that, though, they want to just be able to use delivering economic stability as code for we're not Liz Truss. And we quite like to remind you of Liz Truss. But when you ask them what it means a couple of things. It means tough spending rules and keeping taxes as low as possible. But there isn't a promise to cut taxes just to keep them low. So the sort of detail below that pledge is interesting.
All of this stuff we have heard before. New border security command. Labour had a big old day on that. Great British Energy. You and I were at the party conference when that was announced. Then you get into a crackdown on antisocial behaviour. I mean, look, what politician doesn't suggest that there's too much antisocial behaviour around, particularly when they're in opposition. But there are targets there as well, though. Cutting NHS waiting times by providing 40,000 more appointments every week, recruiting 6,500 new teachers. I mean, there are a couple of metrics on which we can judge the Labour Party in its earliest days of government.
All of this stuff is a bit more complicated than it looks at first sight. 40,000 more appointments each week in order to cut NHS waiting times. Keir Starmer was asked when will he have the 40,000 more appointments on the stream, when in the Parliament will that be the case? And he was unable to give a date. You pick up on the 6,500 new teachers. Now, it's important to say this isn't net. In other words, they will add 6,500 more teachers, but that doesn't take into account effectively the number of teachers that are also separately leaving the profession. They would say the 6,500 is on top of existing recruitment targets, and that this kind of stuff is about filling vacancies and temporary posts as an urgent first step. And there are other pressures. There are pull factors of people from the teaching profession, most notably pay, but also including conditions, that I am left a little confused as to what these 6,500 it really means in real life.
Is this not all a little bit redolent, Sam, of the Ed Stone? Ed Miliband standing next to what became an electoral tombstone for him back when he was leading the party and fighting the election. It's all very well to stick these things down in black and white, but if, when you dig into the detail, it is utterly meaningless, isn't this all a little bit Ed Stone?
My memory of the Ed Stone was just of a catastrophic visual blunder on the eve of the election. I'd frame the question slightly differently and slightly more charitably, Neil, as this. If a promise is woolly, will it be remembered? Will it do the job that you really want to do? Because if the problem is if people like us are arguing over the meaning and the reality of a pledge, in the end, if we're saying we're not really sure this is a thing, then your average punter listening to it is also going to think, well, I don't really need to pay much attention to it. And so then it doesn't really do the job it needs to do. But unless it's clean and hard and understandable and memorable, and then you can measure the delivery against it at the end, then does it really do the job with the public that's needed?
What of the challenge to Keir Starmer? Indeed, it was made at this event that there has been a scaling back in ambition. I mean, certainly, even if you disagree with the idea that he is not as ambitious anymore, he's certainly not being as specific about certain policy areas as he has been in the past.
So they would reply, look, these are just the first steps, and we are still committed to all the other promises that are made in our various 5 missions. But straight away, looking at this, a number of things jump out that we haven't got anything on big priorities for Labour. So workers' rights, renationalising the railways, investing in green projects, breakfast clubs, changing to planning rules, that promise of highest growth in the G7. Now, all of these things, Labour say, we'll do them. They're there. They're just not the things that we're going to champion and jump up and down about in that very first kind of phase. Tony Blair managed to do a lot that wasn't on the pledge cards, like the minimum wage. That is absolutely true. But you couldn't really see that Rishi Sunak's government would want to deliver economic security, cut NHS waiting times. They would say they already have a version of new border security command. Opinions differ as to whether that's the case. They wouldn't create a nationalised energy company, but do want lower bills. They're forever cracking down on antisocial behaviour, and everybody wants new teachers. The things that Labour have put on this pledge card are not issues that divide the Conservative Party and Labour, and that is a really interesting fact. That was also true, broadly speaking, of the 1997 one. And the stuff that does divide Labour from the Tories is not on that. And I think that's because Keir Starmer is looking to present himself, as Rishi Sunak was on Monday, as this stability candidate who will operate in the mainstream of British politics, rather than wanting to highlight the things that Labour would do that the Tories didn't, probably just to get over as many of those Tory votes as he possibly can.
I mean, did we hear anything from Sir Keir Starmer today as to what his foreign policy will be? The reason I'm asking, of course, is Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meeting in Beijing. I'm just wondering whether the absence of foreign policy is a decision that they have made because it is counterproductive to be discussing those matters right now, or is it the case, as his books told me after the event, as when Blair entered Downing Street in '97, they really didn't have a foreign policy and they were making it up in the hoof?
Foreign policy, Neil, is Keir Starmer's biggest problem. It is Keir Starmer's biggest electoral headache, actually, in the shape of Labour's attitude to what's going on in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The greatest dynamic doesn't have to do with, little skirmishes about whether or not he's going to abolish the 2-child limit for benefits, whether or not he will renationalise the railways on day one or allow them to flop back into public ownership when the fragile. It's Gaza and Israel. That is how he deals with that could have more of an impact on this election in some seats with some votes this slightly nebulous pledge card. I think there is just a sense of the party not quite sure what to say. So I would venture that Keir Starmer's biggest headache is foreign policy, even if some of this stuff it just sort of falls through your fingers a bit.
Thank you, Sam. Stay there. We will be back in just a moment with two men Sir Keir Starmer may soon be dealing with directly, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Welcome back. Vladimir Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing today, his first foreign trip since being re-elected Russian president. Ukraine, Israel, energy, trade, all and more were on the table. Nicole Johnston is our Asia correspondent. She joins us from Beijing. Ivor Bennett, our Moscow correspondent, joining us, funnily enough, from Moscow. Nicole, tell us about the summit itself. Russia, China, they certainly do like a little bit of pomp and circumstance.
Most of the action was taking place outside the Great Hall of the People. We saw bands, we saw military, a very long red carpet, handshakes, a lot of warm welcome there for Vladimir Putin. So it was everything that he would have wanted. It's going to play great at home. And it also looks really good for Xi Jinping as well. State broadcasters are covered with it. So a great deal of atmosphere here in Beijing today. And it's not over yet. There'll be a gala dinner, walks in the park, drinking tea. And it's not the first time these two leaders have done it, of course. They've met more than 40 times. It's extraordinary.
On that point, a lot of people will identify today as a moment of significance, but this has been a relationship that has been deepening for quite some time.
Really importantly, this is, I think by my calculation, the fourth time they've met since the start of the war in Ukraine. And that is really telling. I think it shows the deepening ties and Russia's increasing dependence on China. And this all at a time when Russia is increasingly isolated, of course, by the rest of the world. But that's kind of pushed it towards this embrace with China. And it works out for both parties at the moment because they like to project their shared worldview that it's time to move away from the Western-dominated world order. It's time for a new multipolar world. That is their buzzword. And I think we'll hear a lot more about that over the next 2 days.
The language that has been used at this summit has been very, very, very strong indeed. Talk of 75 years of everlasting friendship. But there isn't any doubt, is there, as to who is the senior in this partnership?
Absolutely. And of course, it's China. It's the big brother here. It's calling the shots. China has a lot to benefit from this relationship. It's not all one way, though. China wants what Russia has to offer, which is oil and gas. And in fact, in the case of gas, China has been getting the gas 30% cheaper than what Europe paid for it before the war. Not only oil and gas, though, also agricultural products, food. The big theme as well is this sort of overarching worldview, because these two leaders are aligned on one thing, and that's that the global dominance of the United States should change.
So what specifically, Ivor, does Russia gain from this relationship? There is a tendency in the West to assume that Vladimir Putin views everything through the prism of Ukraine. And certainly on that, at least, I can see China being some assistance.
Yeah, that's been the key factor in why they're so close right now. The sanctions have driven Russia towards China's embrace. Economically speaking, China has given Russia a lifeline. And speaking to people in the street here in the last couple of days, they're very happy about it. There are lots of Chinese cars on the roads here in Moscow. Lots of people have Chinese phones, adverts for Chinese products everywhere. In general, it's cheaper than the European goods they used to have anyway. So it's really kept Russia's economy afloat. There's also, the big concern for the West is it's not just consumer goods coming in, it's also things like machine tools, semiconductors, chemicals as well, things that could help Russia's war economy. And in turn, the concern is by the West that it's fueling Russia's war machine, essentially filling vital gaps in the military-industrial complex. I want to pick up on that last point that Nicole made, that China is clearly the senior partner here. Vladimir Putin won't like being the junior partner. Mm-hmm. And there's said to be a lot of kind of unrest and discomfort among Russia's elites about that kind of imbalance. But Vladimir Putin has said a couple of times, actually, that he's happy in that sense, happy with the relationship, so long as China doesn't interfere with Russia's domestic affairs.
Now, from China's perspective, they maintain that they're a peaceful country, that they are a neutral partner, and that all of these relationships and international organizations and is all sort of part of international cooperation, that they are fully within their right to do that, to trade with whoever they like, including Russia, and to have a relationship with it. So we have seen this pressure really building on China internationally, also with tariffs, talk of sanctions on Chinese banks. But so far, what we're seeing here in Beijing is no sign that Xi Jinping will change tack. He is adamant.
Just tell me then about this geopolitical realignment that clearly is taking place. When Russia looks at its borders, when Russia looks south and sees China, does it see more than a useful ally? Or are we talking about a partnership, a proper partnership moving forward with shared ambitions, shared geopolitical goals?
Yes, it's a partnership, a strategic one, a political one, but there's no kind of formal military alliance here or anything like that. Russia is the junior partner, and it's embroiled in this war in Ukraine. It's an international pariah. China doesn't want to jeopardize its status within the kind of global framework and its relationship with the US by this relationship. So it'll always kind of keep Russia at arm's length. And if Russia becomes a bit of a liability for it, then it will quite quickly diminish its closeness or distance itself. One kind of telling phrase was that you should really see this relationship with Russia in terms of the wider kind of US-China relationship, because that's the really most important one that Beijing has. So on the point on Ukraine, for example, yes, the US is concerned about dual-use goods making their way into the Russian economy, China fueling the war machine. But they have been very careful not to provide ammunition and actual weaponry, and that is a red line, clearly, that they will not cross.
I suppose what China has been trying to do for a considerable amount of time now is to remind people elsewhere in the world who are not necessarily entirely sanguine about the United States and its foreign policy and so on, that there is an alternative, that there is someone else out there with very, very deep pockets, with technological nous, with intelligence gathering capabilities similar to other nations of that size. And they're saying, well, look, if you don't like the Yanks, you can come with us.
There, in the great power politics of the world, we are starting to see this global realignment. We have China offering an alternative worldview, and it is backed by countries like Russia, India, South Africa, Brazil. They want to challenge the dominance of the United States. They say that there's room for a multipolar system, and that's why this meeting, this state visit, is so symbolic, because to see these two world powers on the stage together, in some ways you could say that they're thumbing their nose at the West. We can be friends. Look what we've done. We're not on our own. We have other players, and just wait and see what we can do.
Fundamentally, I think the most important thing for Russia here is about shoring up economic support for its war economy, and just look at the delegation accompanying Vladimir Putin. It speaks volumes. He's got his new defense minister with him, his old defense minister, who's now his security chief. He's got his central bank governor, his finance minister, the boss of the state oil company Rosneft, a few oligarchs there as well, Oleg Deripaska included. And that really speaks volumes. He is going there for economic support first and foremost, but I'm not sure he'll get everything he wants.
If a wedge were to be driven between Russia and China, how might that be done?
I don't see any wedge being driven anytime soon. What we are seeing, though, is this pressure, increasing pressure on China to try and distance itself from its relationship with Russia. China is really trying to straddle the line. It's a really difficult balance for them. It needs to trade with Europe, the United States, and now Russia is also a very useful trading partner both ways. So why not keep that going?
I think it all depends on what Russia does on the battlefield in Ukraine and what it does in its wider kind of conflict and standoff with NATO. If it crosses any red lines that China might have, for example, what about any kind of strikes with a NATO country? There's all this talk from the Kremlin about putting its tactical nuclear forces on standby, lots of rhetoric around potentially using nuclear weapons. And if that does ever happen, that could definitely, I think, drive a wedge between China and Russia.
Ivor Bennett in Moscow, Nicole Johnston in Beijing. Great to chat to both of you. As befits two world leaders with a somewhat laissez-faire attitude to democracy and the rule of law, their geopolitical aims increasingly align. A special relationship, if you will. That China is attempting to reshape the world is undeniable. That it sees Russia as an ally in those efforts is true, for the time being at least anyway. That whoever wins those elections in the United States and United Kingdom needs to be concerned is self-evident. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.